Alright, so what we're going to do is wrap up chapter 9, which is addressing the central nervous system, and then that'll place us into the peripheral nervous system to cover chapters 10 and 11. So specifically, in the central nervous system, we've already just introduced some major functions of it, and then we wanted to go and get into the anatomy. Reminding you, some of this stuff we really introduced in lab a couple of weeks when we did the central nervous system dissection and looked at these things. So a lot of the information will be repetitive for hopes that it's just starting to click and make connections, and so that you can start applying this new knowledge. We introduced the spinal cord in the central nervous system lab, and then we also put it into practice last week when we did the reflexes, looking at how our spinal cord uses proprioception to keep us balanced. If we review the anatomy of the spinal cord, the spinal cord itself isn't very large in diameter. And on yesterday, I posted a new video link in the supplemental videos. I don't know that I made an news item to you guys, but if you want to see a really cool live scan of someone's brain and spinal cord, so it's a cadaver scan, go into the supplemental videos, and you can see not only just the brain, but the spinal cord. So where it's going is the spinal cord's not large at all. So if you look at maybe the tip of your pinky, is a good guesstimate of about the diameter of your spinal cord. But traversing through it, up and down and across, are these really important nerves which allow for communication from the brain and the rest of the body, and back and forth. So the spinal cord, we looked at it in its relationship to the spinal nerves for sensory input and motor output, but it's obviously going to be more extensive than that. In that part of the nerve, or part of the spinal cord, allows for what we call ascending fibers. Before I get into that, let me address this text that just showed up. You recall we talked about anatomically about the spinal cord. The dorsal would be on which side? The back, and the ventral would be on the front. So we have the dorsal and ventral to illustrate anterior, posterior, but additionally nerves will travel via ascending paths. What does that mean, ascending? Up. Okay, so nerve axons would originate somewhere more distal. We got a little axon terminals down there, and they would ascend up and try to approach towards the brainstem or the thalamus or somewhere more towards the brain itself. So they can convey ascending information up towards the brain. Conversely, some nerve pathways travel descending, and these would travel obviously down, away from the brain, down towards the lower portions of the body. When you get into anatomy, you'll probably name these different tracts. Okay, so we don't need to do that here. We just need to be familiar with the terms ascending and descending. And in this image, the ascending tracts have been highlighted for us in the blue, and the descending tracts have been highlighted for us in the purple. So these are, although it looks like solid something, if you could just envision trying to draw thousands of little nerve axons cut in half, and you're just looking at them, and they would, gives us the directionality based on where they're located. Does that make a little bit of sense? Ascending versus descending. What part of the brain do you think an ascending tract might terminate? What part of the brain might an ascending tract terminate?
Brainstem.
It may terminate in the brainstem, and then maybe even more where? In the thalamus, because the thalamus does what? Receives and sorts, right? We said it's that little relay center. Okay, so it could be the brainstem. That could be the thalamus too. So it's ascending up towards the brain. All the regions you guys mentioned. To help put it in perspective, our spinal cord associates with our spinal nerves, which we'll cover in chapter 10. But it's hard to talk about the spinal cord and not talk about the peripheral nervous system. And then so the question is, well, where do these spinal nerves originate? What do they do? And the spinal nerves that branch off of the spinal cord in specific regions have names based on anatomically where they're branching off in the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, etc. portion of the body. And so you could go through and localize different parts of the body and kind of figure out which spinal nerve is probably processing that stimulus and where in the spinal cord any integration might be occurring. So for example, when we did our patellar tendon reflex, if you've got superpower eyes, you may tell which, that's an L4, okay, lumbar 4. They would process that mechanical stimulus that we picked up the other day. So our spinal cord is going to communicate with the sensory nerves, and then it's also, we'll see, part of our reflexes for coordinating our motor outputs for specific regions. So for that, we can go ahead and review a reflex arc, which we became familiar with in lab last week. So I'll have you test yourself in just a moment, but before we start labeling and talking about functionality here, let's just define a reflex. Let's say reflex. An action without conscious thought based on some stimulus. So some stimulus is going to cause your body to carry out an action. You don't have to cognate it. It's a reflex. In order to bring out that action, we have to have what's called the components of a reflex arc, which we became familiar with last week. So what I want you to do is quiz yourself and label the components of a reflex arc. An important something is missing here. What is missing in the middle? The what? Interneuron. So if you want to, I would draw an interneuron in here as well. So I want you to test yourself. Label the components of a reflex arc. You may recall in a reflex arc, there first has to be some specific stimulus. And so the stimulus is going to activate a specific what? Receptor. Where is the receptor located in this image? In the skin, the little blue things in the skin are the receptors. We will review the physiology of our receptors in chapter 10, not today, on Thursday. But basically, they're going to have to depolarize and activate a specific what? Afferent neuron. We can get the directionality shown here for the afferent neuron. And you may recall our spinal afferent nerves are unique in that the cell bodies are actually located closer to the terminals than they are out in the periphery of the body, where they originate. What did we call this area where if you have more than one neuron or nerve cell, and all those cell bodies are grouped together? What did we call those? Ganglion. When we have a cluster of cell bodies, you can have a ganglion. This one is on the dorsal side of the spinal nerve, so we call it the dorsal root ganglion. The afferent nerves in a reflex arc terminate where? In the central nervous system, on the interneurons, specifically in what part? The horn, the ventral, the dorsal, we said, right? The dorsal horn, and that's made up of what type of matter? Gray matter. Very good. So that little axon, if you tie back to chapter 7 and 8, stores and releases neurotransmitter when it gets what? When what goes into it? And what causes our neurotransmitter to be released? Calcium. So, right, tying back to chapter 8, this nerve cell would generate an action potential, influx calcium, release neurotransmitter, not into some wide open space here, but actually into a cleft, and specifically onto some interneuron, which I try to draw here in the green thing. The interneurons act as our what? integration center, control center, set point, determining, relaying area. Notice because we have a synapse, the dendrites, cell bodies of the interneurons, are towards the dorsal side, and their terminals are more towards the ventral side. So these two could release or first generate an action potential and then release neurotransmitter. The neurotransmitter of our interneurons, though, should communicate with what? The efferent nerves, the motor efferent nerves, which are shown by which cells here? The purple ones, very good. If you look at the motor efferent nerves, I'd like you to note that the cell bodies are located where? In the gray matter. Because the interneurons can't extend out. They have to stay exclusively in the gray matter. And then so you'll find the motor nerves, cell bodies, originating there in the gray matter. When excited, they can generate an action potential and then extend out through some part of the body and then terminate with what? And reflex arc, efferent nerves terminate with the target, effector. In this case, it is a muscle. It could be a gland. It doesn't have to be skeletal muscle. It could be smooth muscle, cardiac muscle. Pick your favorite effector organ. If it's controlled by the nervous system, an efferent nerve is going to synapse upon it. And release what? Our nerves release, chapter 5, 7, 8. Neurotransmitter, thank you. So if our neurotransmitters release, or excuse me, if our nerve cells release neurotransmitter, our effectors need what? Receptors. The relationship is still constant, like we studied several weeks ago. A target releases a messenger, or excuse me, a source releases a messenger, and the target should express a receptor. This all happens within a few milliseconds. You don't have to use any, may not have to use any ascending or descending tracks to carry this, but you certainly wouldn't see it cognating in the brain, the frontal lobe, in your emotional response to a patellar tendon reflex, for example. It's just gonna happen. What questions do you have about the components of a reflex arc, or tying it into our lab last week, or the anatomy we studied a couple weeks before that? To remind you, in the spinal nerves, all of our nerves are mixed. Right? We said they have both afferent and efferent nerve fibers in them. Chapter 10, we're going to address the afferent nervous system, and then chapter 11, the efferent nervous system. There are various types of reflexes. Table 9.3 looks like it didn't show up very well in the projection, but this is screenshotted from your textbook. If you turn to 9.3, there are various types of reflexes. Some may be spinal, like which we illustrated, like the patellar tendon reflex, for example. However, our cranial nerves can also carry out reflexes, like our pupillary reflex. We don't have to think about constricting or dilating our pupils. It happens by a reflex. Some are controlled autonomically. That means using the sympathetic nervous system, parasympathetic nervous system, so on and so forth. Okay, so there's various levels of reflexes. Figure 9.10a reiterates what we mentioned in lab, in that sensory stimuli can travel up via what type of paths? We go up by ascending tracks and then terminate in the thalamus. If this is a somatosensory stimulus, what part of my brain would the thalamus activate? The which one? parietal lobe. If it is a visual stimulus, occipital lobe. And then an auditory stimulus, temporal lobe. Very good. So our spinal nerves may convey some type of information, and if it's more than a reflex, you may actually think about something. So if we look at the scenario, putting your hand on it or poking yourself with a rose thorn, you're going to have a reflex, right? You're going to spontaneously have a somatic reflex. You're going to pull your hand away. However, you're probably also going to have an emotional, like physical response. You're going to say, you're not going to cognitively, like verbally say it, but in your brain you're going to think, oh, sharp pointy thing on a rose hurts. Let's not do that again. Okay? And so you have to first process, if you cognate it, that hurts, that's whatever, however you localize it, that was on my finger or whatever, you're going to have to use these ascending tracks up to the thalamus and then onto the parietal lobe for further processing. Okay. So just because you have a reflex, you may also have additional cognition about the stimulus. And that's how you learn from the environment. So next time you see a thorny rose bush, you won't go hug it, right? Because you know that that's probably going to hurt based on your previous experience. So you've got that parietal lobe association. Okay, so we've got to not only do the protective reflex, but also think about it so we can learn and not hurt ourselves next time. Conversely, in this pathway, we're going to talk about nociceptors coming up in chapter 10. Again, the ascending pathways would synapse eventually in the thalamus. And in this case, we said proprioception, or not proprioception, but somatosensation occurs in the parietal lobe. What about when I carry on a reflex and I've got some type of cognation, and I'm holding the rose and it hurts, and I want to figure out how to re-handle the rose so I don't prick myself again and have another reflex. What part of the brain do I now need to incorporate? The frontal lobe. And what type of tracts in the spinal cord? Descending tracts. Okay, so if you follow that up, and this next section is a cross section of the frontal lobe. We can see you may be able to see some cell bodies originating in the frontal lobe. They would extend descending towards the area of the thalamus, and they continue to descend until we would get to an actual spinal efferent nerve. So figure 9.10b reiterates that the role of the frontal lobe is going to give us some motor planning ability. So those commands have to come out of the frontal lobe, use these descending tracts of the spinal cord, and then activate a motor efferent nerve to allow for the physical reaction, movement, or whatever the case may be. Does this help a little bit? Putting together the efferent and afferent nerves and the ascending tracts, how they're collectively, and then also tying in the role of our different lobes that we introduced in lab. Does this bring about any questions? Figure 919 illustrates another reflex arc. So let's go through this. This would be our, the hammer would be the stimulus, and the patella we would have our receptors. In this case, we're looking at this showing the stretch receptors in the muscle, which we haven't talked about, but there are, so we'll move up a little bit. In the muscles, we have receptors that activate afferent nerves, and then here we have our interneurons, which would select the appropriate efferent nerves back in the same part of the body to coordinate our effector organs. And so this might help you realize the mixed classification of our spinal nerves. They're starting and going to the same part of the body, so might as well group them together. This turns me to something that I failed to add to your guided notes, but I think there's room here, is how this under figure 919, I want to turn your attention to this interneuron area. When you carry out some type of physical reaction, like extending a limb, okay, so let's just do this. And the easiest way to do this is have you take your dominant hand, you got that too, right? So take your dominant hand, and you're going to use both. You're going to take your non-dominant hand and place it over your biceps and triceps, so you can feel both portions of your muscle. And so what I want you to do is just bend at the elbow, and then extend, bend, extend. And I want you to really kind of enhance your muscle activity. Notice what is happening between the muscle groups. When you extend, which muscle group is active? The triceps when you extend, and then when you contract, the biceps. So in doing this just very simple action, it's spilling water, sorry. To make the motion, one set of muscles need to relax, and the other need to contract. We don't need both groups relaxing, and we don't need both groups contracting simultaneously, because then we wouldn't have the motion. And then so to coordinate this, we need to simultaneously excite some nerves that go to those effector organs, and the other nerve should be what? Should be what? The nerves, what term would we use though instead of relaxing a nerve, what would we do? Rested or even inhibited, right? Hyperpolarized. This is coordinated through the central nervous system. This simultaneous excitation and inhibition of some nerves so that we can do a motion, so we can excite some muscle groups and relax others, is called reciprocal innervation. Reciprocal. So this is what I want you to add to your guided notes. Reciprocal innervation. Reciprocal innervation. Let's work at the last word first. If something's innervated, it has nerves in it. So if something's innervated, it's got nerves in it. That's good. We're in the nervous system. The nerves in them, though, work what? You may recall this from your math nightmares. Opposite. Okay, very good. Opposite. In order for us to do a motion, some of our effector organs need to be reciprocally innervated, oppositely innervated. Some excited, some not inhibited. Some should be. So in order to do things like a withdrawal reflex, some muscle groups are excited while others are inhibited. Or we could say the muscle groups are reciprocally innervated. So this is when you're comparing, we'll say, multiple effectors. Could be reciprocally innervated, like the biceps, triceps analogy we gave just a moment ago. I don't want you to confuse the term reciprocal innervation with dual innervation. Because innervation just means what? Having nerves. Reciprocal means opposite. On Thursday, we're going to use a word meaning dual innervation, where one organ has, dual means two types of nerves in it. Okay, so we're going to differentiate that. Reciprocal innervation, we're looking at for reflexes, and we're going to contrast on Thursday dual innervation. From the spinal cord, we can go on and look at the brain itself. If you recall, the brain has a really cool structure. It has three primary areas, which I have outlined kind of ready for you to fill in your guided notes. If you look at your guided notes, it has a 1, 2, 3, and then different placeholders below them. We'll identify just the 3 areas first and then add some detail in another image. The first area of the brain is called the forebrain. We're going to add some substructures to it. The brain itself is comprised of an area which we'll refer to as the forebrain. My animation is off and I forgot to fix it yesterday, so the next thing that's going to show, I want you to place on item 3. The third area of the brain is called the cerebellum. And then the second area is the what? The brainstem. So your brain, you have the forebrain, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. All of these structures we can see superficial without having to dissect to the brain. But we know, based on our dissection the other day, that there's a lot going on. This isn't just a hollow chamber, right? Something. There's a lot of cells and anatomy within the brain itself. So if we refer to the forebrain is made up of some important structures, including the cerebrum, or you could say cerebral cortex. We talked about the cortex when we did the anatomy lab a couple of weeks ago. Another major area of the forebrain is referred to as the diencephalon. And this is just the internal structures, not the folded cortex. And so everything below that, that's not the brainstem, and that's not the cortex. So we're kind of in this area. There are more structures than what I'm going to highlight here, but I've just picked out the ones that we've introduced, and then we're going to use throughout the rest of the semester. So 2 important areas of the diencephalon include the familiar thalamus and hypothalamus. The thalamus, this kind of central area, you may recall it was kind of I described it as like button shape. It was really kind of very circular in the brain. What did we say the thalamus does? Relays information between the brain and the spinal cord. And it just kind of sorts and groups, filters, etc. And all kinds of other stuff. Emotional responses, learning, but we've been looking exclusively at the sensory relay. So anything that we list in the brain does more than just what we're listing. It's so complex, how these different regions work together. Another structure below it is appropriately called because it's referred to as the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus looks pretty uneventful, right? Like, that's it? And hear about that hypothalamus? You look at the dissection, like, man, it's kind of underwhelming to do a gross anatomy dissection of it. But just because it doesn't look really exciting doesn't indicate that it's not important. It's critical for your life. It's critical for your survival. It maintains set point for almost everything in your body. Temperature, pH, carbon dioxide, oxygen, you name it. Emotional responses, feeling full after a meal, all involved and regulated by the cells in the hypothalamus. Furthermore, we'll see it coming up in chapter 6 and in lab this week because it's going to integrate a lot of our endocrine behavior as well. What's this guy right here? The pituitary gland. So those are some structures within the diencephalon.
Is the corpus callosum part of that?
Technically, yes. If I'm getting that.
Since it's not non-folded.
Correct. I'm pretty sure it is falling into the category of the diencephalon. So you got your cortex, internal structures. Other structures which fall into the diencephalon would be the area above the thalamus called the epithalamus, including the pineal gland. And so there's a lot of, this is just looking at a tiny little cross section really of the brain. So try not to, it's evading me right now, but I think technically you could say that the corpus callosum is in the diencephalon. Good question. So we have the forebrain, the cortex. We'll go through and look at those lobes in a moment. The diencephalon, the structures we're looking at include the thalamus and the hypothalamus. And then below that would be the brainstem. The brainstem has three major areas. We didn't look at all of them in lab during the dissection. The one that we really didn't point out is an area called the midbrain. So you may recall it visually from the dissection, but moving a little bit more posterior from the hypothalamus, right below, if you will, the thalamus, is an area called the midbrain. Below it would be an area called the pons. You should have a visual memory of this, of that little swollen area of the brainstem that was branching out. And then in the middle would be the medulla oblongata. Medulla oblongata are just cells, tracts that run up and down to the middle, the oblong region of the brainstem. The nerve fibers just traveling up and down, ascending and descending, if you will. You should recall the brainstem's function from lab last week, in that's where our cranial nerves, most of them either entered or exited out of at some point, just kind of moving right through the anatomy. So think of the brainstem visually analogous to like a network of highways, or roadways, or you don't have roads in your brain, but you have nerve cells that travel this way and that way. So that we can have connections from the cerebellum to the spinal cord, to the brainstem, to the frontal lobe, and vice versa. So we've got all these various pathways. Does that make sense if I call it a highway, kind of traveling information, axons extending from one region to another? If we review the cerebral cortex, we identify that there are 4 primary lobes, as identified here in the shaded area. So the purple lobe is labeled as we've been calling the frontal lobe. What's the primary function of it?
Motor, sensory,
Emotional,
higher thought,
higher thought. What else do we say? Processing, reasoning, a lot of our emotional planning, intellectual type of things, all do occur in the frontal lobe. And so when you take maybe your psych classes, you'll go into more in the frontal lobe. We're going to limit our studies to a tiny slice of the frontal lobe, which we've already seen, that gives us motor control for specific portions of the body. So our somatic commands come out of the frontal lobe here. Behind it would be the parietal lobe, which we said gives us somatosensory. So body sensations are processed here in the parietal lobe. The next lobe, shaded in green, is the occipital lobe, which we said has a primary role in visual processing. And in the yellow, we have the temporal lobe, which has an important role in hearing and auditory processing. All right, so what I want to do is just go through and repeat those with some additional visuals. Yes?
When we went over the brain anatomy, the forebrain and brainstem, we didn't go over the cerebellum. Is there anything you want us to know?
Sure. The cerebellum, I'm sorry for omitting it. So the cerebellum is referred to as the hindbrain. It's sometimes called like the little brain, if you will. It's important for many processes, including what we try to note in lab, including the maintenance of balance. Okay, so when you do something like sit, seems rather innocuous, right? You're like, okay, I'm sitting. But you don't randomly fall over because your cerebellum is communicating with your proprioreceptors and outputting with your muscles. So when you do a planned activity, or even just staying upright in the environment, just walk, what you might seem easy, consider something easy to do, walking in the environment, takes a very programmed, coordinated effort between the cerebellum, the frontal lobe, and etc. So it's important for maintenance of balance. It gives us, because of the nerves that travel through it, like a highway, without it, you may have problems controlling respiration and heart rate, for example. Motor pathways are traveling through there. The cerebellum also gives us the ability to recognize patterns in the environment and sequences. So like rudimentary things like problem, like puzzle solving, for example, you're using the pathways through the cerebellum. So sleep patterns, it's involved in background operations. Is that a bad? You know, it's kind of behind the scenes, keep you alive, out of danger cells for an oversimplification of what it does. Okay. If we review the cortex functions, and so we're just going to go back through the different lobes. So we're starting again at the frontal lobe. We said we're just going to zoom in on one function which is involved with motor planned voluntary movements. When you plan a movement, you may recall what we studied in lab, that the left hemisphere coordinates right-sided activities, and then the right hemisphere coordinates left-sided activities. And the same thing, right, is true here in the frontal lobe. And so this is a slice of the frontal lobe, just the left frontal lobe. And if you look at the pictures associated with it, you see something looking pretty odd. And this is called a homunculus, meaning like little monster. If you look at that guy, right, a little bit disproportionate looking, right? This is, some artist has put this together to represent the parts of the frontal lobe, that primary motor cortex, these cells which are dedicated for coordinating movement in specific parts of the body on the opposite side of the body. They look disproportionate because the brain has a disproportionate amount of gray matter to controlling different parts of the body. So the bigger something is shown, that tells us the more motor control is dedicated to that part of the body. So we can see a lot of gray matter is dedicated to controlling our what? The face is looking pretty giant right there, right? And also our hands, which makes sense. We need our face and hands for precise movement, for communication, eating, or just your kind of survival skills, or in very fine type of motor skills. Contrasting that to, say, the movement of the muscles of your elbow, okay, or your toe, for example. You can control those, but not to the near the precision that you could, say, your mouth and your hand, because we have more cells that coordinate motor activity of the mouth and the hand, for example. So this is referred to as a motor homunculus, because that's looking at the cells for motor control. You can look at a similar homunculus for sensory, and you would call that a sensory homunculus, and that would be a cross-section of which lobe? Which one? The parietal lobe. Oh, excuse me, I'm getting ahead of myself. Those cells represented by the motor homunculus would command, right, via descending tracts to carry out some motor pathway. By contrast, oh, I'm totally getting ahead of myself. Let me get to that sensory in just a second. I wanted to show figure 9.21 to you as well. You don't have to write all the steps down. Okay? I just want you to be thoughtful about what your brain, what your body goes through when it plans a movement. If you want to move in the environment, you're like, I got free will, I can move. Well, you can, yes, but first you've got to plan it. You've got to cognate this voluntary movement. And so you've got to come up with an idea. And so your ideas may come from what's called your limbic system, which is basically your emotional responses. Planning from that, remember from our lab we talked about the premotor cortex and et cetera. So coming from those areas. So you've got to first get the idea of the plan to move, okay, but still you haven't automatically moved. Then when you plan it, then you can program it. Okay, so your brain's like, all right, well, I'm going to get up and walk, so I need to activate my muscles, so my leg, my back, and abdomen, etc. And so the correctly associated cells in the frontal lobe are grouped and activated. Okay, so you're going to use all of the frontal lobe. Sometimes this may be as far as you get. This what happens at about 12:05, and you're sitting there and you got all your stuff and you are ready to go. You're waiting, and I'm like, 10 more minutes, we're going to use it, we got it. And so you wait, and you're planning. You're like, I'm going to walk through that, I'm going to bust that door down, right? You're planning. But you don't yet because you're waiting, right? So just physically thinking about something, you're using, or thinking about doing a movement, you're using your motor cortex as if you were carrying out the activity. And so this is why, for example, athletes might just sit down and think about going through a motion. They don't have to necessarily do the motion, they just have a game plan, if you will, in their brain about an action. If you're a softball player, a basketball player, or keep naming your sports or whatever, just thinking about it helps make those connections for those movements. And at some point, you're going to have to execute the pathway, and then you may carry out for the movement of the muscle. Once you carry out the movement, then there's feedback. Tying back to what we learned in chapter 7, you moved, you've now changed the environment. The muscles are stretched or relaxed or whatever, you're balanced, and it's all going, processing at the same time. It's got visual information, vestibular information coming in, stretching, etc. It all feeds back to your thought process and your planning and etc. So it's not so simple just to make a motor movement, no matter how little or big the movement is. So figure 9.21 illustrates the complexity of the voluntary movement. But the point is, you've got to plan for it first in the frontal lobe before you can ever execute it in your skeletal muscles. Does that bring about any questions? Some important structures within the diencephalon area is called the basal nuclei. The basal nuclei are kind of at the bottom of the brain. Bottom's not a good word. Basal is the better term to describe that. But within the core of the brain is a region called the basal nuclei. So right around your thalamus area, and so these areas are highlighted in here. And so we didn't cut through these in our brain dissection. So if we just went a little bit more lateral, we would have cut through the basal nuclei. The cells of the basal nuclei, which are in the frontal area of the brain, allow for us work with this voluntary movement. Okay? More importantly, more of it. What they help us do, what the cells of the basal nuclei help us do, is carry forward purposeful movement. I was trying to think of purposeful, intentional movement. Yeah. So when you're sitting here, let me illustrate it. When you're sitting here, are all of your muscles contracting and relaxing? No, some of them are certainly relaxing. And so when you carry out a purposeful movement, your body needs to inhibit some nerves, kind of illustrated with the reflex, but it may need to excite others. And so it's the role of the basal nuclei to make sure that those muscle cells and organs that should be relaxed during a particular movement are relaxed. Okay? What happens if the basal nuclei are not functioning properly? Do what? Tension?
Contracting, like some people will not be able to relax and they'll be like in the kind of like fetal position.
Yeah, so if it's continuous, you may just see the whole body just tensing upon itself. What's a less severe condition of the basal nuclei not working, which would normally inhibit unnecessary movement? You do see some twitching. Tourette's may be, it may be a basal nuclei condition, I'm not sure, but it could be. There's another well-known motor pathway, and there's tremoring. Parkinson's is what it's called. So you know anybody with Parkinson's? They got the tremors. Yeah. It's because their basal nuclei are inhibiting their muscles. Okay, so you can appreciate it how it works, and you see it not working in somebody else. And so figure 9.23 may help put together when we're doing movement that not only say the cortex, the primary motor cortex is involved, mentioned, we said our cerebellum's involved with purposeful movement. Talked about the basal nuclei. We mentioned the thalamus is more than just a relay center, right? So it's all these regions are integrated for various inputs and outputs as well. So the area of the basal nuclei are dedicated for suppressing some muscle cells when we're trying to do a movement so that we aren't tremoring or contracting when we don't need to be. Yes?
What were the three structures? There was like the caudate nucleus, the putamen.
It's called the putamen, caudate nucleus, thalamus, pallidus. And you're okay. I'm not going to go into these regions. If you can say those are the basal nuclei who would purposely inhibit unnecessary movement, I am very happy. You're good with that. But if you go on anatomy, you may. I'm not sure what level they get into those areas. Where I was transitioning a moment ago is about the parietal lobe. If we could do a slice of the parietal lobe, you would see a similar looking homunculus, but this one's called a sensory homunculus, depicting areas of the body disproportionately for what part of the brain or the parietal lobe processes sensory information for those areas. And so what do we see here again?
Mostly face.
The face
And hand.
and hands also have a lot of sensory dedication in the brain. Okay. So, which makes sense, right? Again, the face is important for your survival, not only communicating, but also receiving, right? You got all your important organs here for eating and communicating, etc. This is called a sensory homunculus. Cross section of the primary somatosensory cortex of which lobe? The parietal lobe. And we could do a similar reminder about how this gets the information. It's by way of ascending tracts, which would terminate in the thalamus and then activate another set of nerves, which will go to a specific part of the parietal lobe. The other lobes, the occipital lobe, we know gives us visual processing. The image is projecting pretty light up here, but maybe you can kind of take away, this is looking superficial, cut through the brain. We can see the optic nerve shown in the purple and the blue, and then how they would terminate back into the into the occipital lobe for visual input. So the occipital lobe receives sensory information from the optic nerve for visual input and its specializations of it. Question?
Which chapter is that?
This is figure 1040. So okay, I pulled it from chapter 10. That should be figure 1040. Is that right? I went ahead and pulled it up because sensory physiology, but it's hard to, I thought you would like a visual say, well, just instead of the occipital lobe, right, well, here's how it works. Our optic nerve conveys to the thalamus, which activates the occipital lobe. Similarly, did I give it? I don't know that I gave it to you. Did I give you all this? The resolution isn't that great. So, I wanted to give an alternative image as well, maybe a little bit better compared to what your textbook has for the temporal lobe, which allows for us, what type of processing? Auditory, which is what we're calling hearing. Similarly, we have to have afferent nerves that originate in the ear. They would activate nerves, fibers that would synapse into our thalamus area and then activate nerves in the temporal lobe. So the point of this is the point of the temporal lobe is auditory processing. But I like this image because it gives you a physical part of the body correlating how those afferent nerves get to the temporal lobe. So the temporal lobe is involved in auditory processing. If we look at the diencephalon of the brain, we talked about the thalamus and some of its important regions. And we've already repeated this a few times today. We said the thalamus gives us integration, conveying sensory information to the appropriate lobe. But we saw some of our motor nerves descend out around the thalamus as well. And so it's just a relay center. Similarly, we've already discussed the function of the hypothalamus. And so the hypothalamus, we said, categorized as autonomic functions, and I said maybe your life-sustaining functions. So we said temperature, food intake, mentioned its role in controlling the anterior pituitary, and then I have the ellipses there as well, because it's involved with darn near everything. So maintaining set points for quite a bit of your body is regulated through the hypothalamus. We're just kind of crash coursing it here, but we'll look at its structure a little better when we get into chapter 6, the endocrine system and how it talks with the pituitary. Any questions so far? Some other specializations which we talked about in the cerebral cortex is the ability to form and interpret language. We talked about 2 areas. What were the 2 areas? The Broca's and the Wernicke's. The Broca's area located in the, which lobe? Frontal lobe. So it is a frontal lobe that tells us motor. So motor commands for speech formation. By contrast, the Wernicke's area in which lobe? It's adjacent to the temporal, it's adjacent to the occipital, and it would be in the parietal lobe mostly. So in the parietal lobe. So what does this area, the Wernicke's area, allow for us?
Language comprehension.
Language comprehension. So you read, yay! Very good. It does allow for us language comprehension. And we mentioned it's kind of like at the intersex of the occipital lobe and the temporal lobe. So that tells us we can comprehend language by reading it. And we can comprehend language by hearing it. And so we can specialize, mix these bits of information here and make sense of any verbal words, or maybe even read words that we experience or comprehend. And so what we'll do is spend the next few minutes talking about learning and memory. You'll know as a student there's a difference, right, between experiencing something and recalling it. There's a difference between learning something and having a memory for it. We'll test your ability to learn and recall on Tuesday. A big test coming up. And so what you've been doing for the last 3 or 4 weeks is acquiring new information. At least in this class, if not other classes, and hopefully in everything you do, your brain is working and learning it. So it doesn't have to be content rich like physiology, just learning how to put a key in the ignition of a vehicle. I mean, that's all right part of learning. But the ability to recall it, first store it and recall it, is memory. Good old trickery memory. So there are 2 types of memory. What are the 2 types?
Short-term, long-term.
Short-term and long-term. The 2 types of memory are short-term and long-term. Short-term memory is also called fleeting memory. And it may last a few seconds, maybe a few hours. Pushing it beyond a few hours is probably a long-term memory. Additionally, your short-term memory may be, it's usually limited to like 7 to 8 bits of information. However you group the group, 7 to 8 somethings. Which, for example, like remembering a phone number is easy to do. You don't need to worry about the area code, right? So I could give you my office phone number, 733-7553. You could probably recall that long enough to write it down, right? And so that's easy. That's why when you study, sometimes creating acronyms, like oil rig is easy to remember, right? Oil rig, oxidation is loss, reduction is gains. You can retain that long enough until you can make some other association. So our short-term memory is referred to as our fleeting memory, lasts seconds to hours. If something has been selected for retention, then it will be converted to long-term memory. And this is, I put quotes around here, limitless. So supposedly you can store and retain everything, but we know that there's some ifs and buts about that. And so if we look at our long-term memory, there are two subcategories, which we'll call fact and procedural memory. If we review the two phases of long-term memory, one is called fact or declarative memory, and the other is called procedural or skill memory. Okay, so, I mean, they almost describe themselves. Procedural or skill is what? Like an action. Okay, so physically doing something. When you brush your teeth every morning, you're using a skill memory. You don't have to think about your motor. It's just you've got a motor memory in there. Fact or declarative memory is probably what you're more familiar with as a student, learning new bits of cognitive information, not reliant so much on doing something unless you're, in this class we do draw a lot, so I mean that would call in though your procedural memory, right? So just learning facts and etc. are classified as declarative memory. What I want to do is test your fact memory. So if I could just turn your attention to the board, I'm going to show you a quick image, and I just want you to get as much factual information as you can. All right. Whoa. All right, you got some information though, right? What factual information did you get?
There's a guy with
It's a guy.
brown suit.
Brown suit. He had a brown. Blue tie. Good. Like short hair. I always catch a smile.
Brown eyes, smile.
Smile. Handsome. Why didn't we say, oh, that's a Homo sapiens? Or, you know, like go to biology, right? That's right? We could have done all that, right? Do it. Oh, you're like, they're asking you a question. So you got a lot of information on that guy. All right, let's do one more test. Oh my gosh. Okay, I messed that
Went
one
too
up.
fast.
I hit
Went
the
too
button. I hit the button and programmed to go. All right. So what did you see?
Barack Obama.
Okay. We saw some hand gestures. We saw President Obama. Why didn't you tell me a handsome guy in a suit? Because you have some declarative memory already.
If we say the president,
Do what?
if we say he's the president, so that means a lot, you know?
That implies a lot.
Describe too much.
Do what?
We don't need to describe too much.
Because you already have declarative memory in your brain. So when I say the president, or I say President Obama, that implies he's probably wearing a suit today. He's probably got a nice smile, you know, and keep on going on. The other guy, though, you don't know who he is. We know he is a person. He's Larry Wade. I always giggle when I see his picture, but that's why I was laughing. So he's a real person, but I mean, you could use the same kind of characters, right? But we didn't know you didn't know who he was, probably, unless you're into like track and field or something like that. You probably wouldn't know who Larry Wade is, but now you do. Next time you see that picture, you would say, well, that's,
Will you go back to the picture?
yeah, let's see who Larry Wade is. That's an old picture, obviously, of him. He has no idea that I show this every semester, so. All right. So we tested our fact memory. And the point of that demonstration is to show you that you have factual information. You can look at somebody and you don't know who they are, right? But you could gather information about what they're wearing because you've seen a jacket before. You've seen, oh, someone said blue tie, right? The tie is actually gold colored. The shirt is blue. But you've seen a shirt before. You've seen a tie before. So you even just said suit, which would imply maybe a tie and a shirt, for example. So that's all declarative memory.
I've never seen a tower have a knot at the top.
Yeah.
Don't
So-
judge.
Alright, so declarative memory, we base information
No,
on
the
previous
draft is not.
experiences. And so if we try to